Howdy friends, we're back with our day 3 of a European history review. I understand that last night we had some problems with the orientation, so I'm going to try and fix that before we get started. Hopefully it won't take too long. I'm just going to quickly go on another device to see what's going on with the orientation. Thank you for your patience. Hopefully you have enjoyed these live review sessions. And it looks like we're still
Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to
in the
our
opposite
review.
way.
Sorry for any problems last night. We're still working out.
We're still... Yeah, and it looks like we're good with the orientation, so I think we can jump right in. Sorry for that delay. So tonight we're going to be going over the growth of European nation-states in the 1500s and 1600s. So just a couple things you need to know before we can dive in. The centralization of governments at this time, it led to the rise of powerful nation-states. And during the time, there was a lot of European exploration of all around the globe. And during this time, there were also regional wars all over the continent. So Spain and Portugal were the main explorers, and they went in the Atlantic and soon went to other colonies, and they eventually just wanted to get as much wealth and military power as possible. They also wanted gold and silver from the Americas, and as a result of this, the balance of power was kind of offset from in the Mediterranean basin, and it kind of shifted to control of the Atlantic coast of Europe. So the wealth from the mines from the Americas, it directly went into the Spanish colonies, and it created a financial and commercial center in Spain. And it also brought inflation in Europe due to the high prices of gold and how much it boosted the economy. But a soon result of this, a couple years after, it actually led to the decline of Spain as a major power. Also, before we can dive in, we need to go over the concept of feudalism, that during this time, it started to die gradually. The 100 Years' War, which I think I touched upon in the last video, which was from 1337 to 1453, it absolutely devastated France, and it exhausted the nobility, which indirectly led to a strong monarchy. So peace actually encouraged commerce, and excuse me for 1 sec, I'll be right back. I have to go deal with something. I greatly apologize for that disturbance. Hopefully it won't happen again. There's a problem going on. So back to the 100 Years' War going on in France. So since there was a decline in nobility, that actually led to a strong monarchy, and commerce also rised, and the middle class started getting to be taxed. And then because of this, the monarchs of France centralized the state, and the rich administrators were brought into government to strengthen the army. So back to England. Because there was the strong government that developed in France, it directly went with the system that evolved in England. So the powers of the English kings that had been checked by the nobility, that goes all the way back to the 13th century with the Magna Carta. The Tudors actually took the English throne in the 15th century, and as a compromise among the clergies who battled over it in the War of the Roses, which I didn't get to talk about in the last video, but hopefully we can talk about later. So having only the one hereditary right to the monarchy. They were forced to work through Parliament, which then gradually represented a greater portion of the English society and then avoided the class distinction that divided France. So, also, I talked about the Reformation in the last video. This had a lot of effect on the English government. The independence of the Anglican Church from the papacy actually strengthened the monarchy and the Parliament, and then with the Puritan Revolution, this established the supremacy of Parliament in it over the king, and it actually also nurtured the tradition of constitutionalism. So, also in Eastern Europe, absolutism grew, and then this was especially in Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Social reform was kind of sporadic, and it didn't really work, and it was kind of widespread. But so on to exploration and colonization. This was mainly in Portugal and Spain. So Christopher Columbus, the most famous navigator, he wanted to find a direct route to Asia from Spanish. Everyone knows this. Couple other people you might need to know are Magellan, who was the first person to circumnavigate the globe. He was for Spain. And then Cortez and Pizarro, they went to the lands of the Aztecs and Incas and, killed them and took over their lands and took their gold and silver. Just one concept of the Columbian Exchange that was the exchange of valuable goods and resources from each continent with the diseases. Not too important, but term might just want to know. So, as I talked upon in the last video too, with the 30 Years' War, which was the religious conflict, which was the entire last video. If you don't want to know more about religious conflicts, go watch the last one. The 30 Years' War, which was the religious conflict, it eventually evolved into a national struggle for dominance of Central Europe, and then it led to the destruction of vast areas, as I said, in Germany, and it also led to the decline of the regional monarchy of the Holy Roman Empire. So the Austrian Habsburgs then confronted the Muslim Ottoman Turks because they wanted to try to expand their control of Eastern Europe. So the 1683 attack on Austria by the forces of Solomon the Magnificent was actually beaten back, and then the Austrians gained control of Bohemia, Hungary, and a ton of other countries. So then Russia and Western Europe in the 18th century, they experienced radically different paths of development. For many, many centuries, the princes of Moscow had been retainers of the Mongol conquerors, and the Tsars were able to use their influence with the Mongols to consolidate their power over the Russian people. But Ivan the Terrible, he was an autocratic expansionist who actually limited the power of the nobles, and he wanted to expand the realm, which solidified his role as the Tsar. After his death, there was a lot of chaos, known as the Time of Troubles. This was seen with a lot of civil war, and there's no heir, so there's once again just total chaos. So shortly after that, the Reimann Dynasty was actually established by the nobles in 1613, and the family ruled for a really long time with an iron hand, and they actually reinstated serfdom, and they gained a lot of control, and they even gained control of the Russian Orthodox Christian Church. So, still in Russia, Peter the Great came shortly after that era too. He expanded the power of the state and of the Tsars, and he established a powerful army, a civil service, and I think an educational system. And he just wanted to train technicians, basically, and he wanted to really westernize Russia. That's really important, that Peter the Great wanted to westernize Russia and bring it up to date with the other world at the time. So he also started economic burdens. He did social redistributions over the peasants, and he actually just gained a lot more power in the process. He also erected St. Petersburg, famous city in the Baltic, and it was magnificent and had like a ton of like palaces and churches and public buildings. Not too important. So while this is going on in Russia, in France there's still the development of absolutism going on. So this started with Francis I in around the early 1500s. He was a Holy Roman Empire. He was against Charles V and Francis I and Charles V. They tried to battle for power. And then they were actually able to weaken the Habsburgs as Europe's most powerful family, but this actually consolidated the absolutism in France, and it actually instituted attacks across the country. So then the concordant of Bologna, this granted the Pope the right to collect revenue from the taxes, and this made money for the church. And then in return from this, the church had the power to the court had the power to nominate high officials in the church, so they kind of went hand in hand, the church and the parliament at that time. So by effectively nationalizing the church, it increased the power of the monarchy and the church at the same time, so it kind of went hand in hand. So Francis I's successor, Henry II, he opposed any reform to the church because he thought that it might weaken his influence over the country. He actually persecuted the French Calvinists, the Huguenots, and he continued persecution under his successors, who were Francis II and Charles XI. So they actually provoked civil war, and this went on for a couple years, but this actually came to an end by the Edict of Tolerance, which was instituted by Catherine de' Medici, who was the queen regent, I think, over Charles XI. So the Civil War still went on in the background, and the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day was absolutely horrible. This was when a ton of Catholic mobs slaughtered the Huguenot leaders who had gathered in Paris to celebrate a wedding. It was a lot of bloodshed, but on this day, 10% of the French population was killed, which was absolutely insane. So, as persecution and civil war is going on in France, Henry VI is now on the throne, and he made France Catholic. He issued the Edict of Nantes, which is significantly important. It expressed a lot of religious tolerance, and it guaranteed religious freedom to the Huguenots and any other religions that were in the minority at the time. And his his finance minister, the Duke of Sully, he also reformed the tax collection system, and he made it more equitable and efficient. He improved transportation. He stimulated the trade industry. Just did a lot of other stuff to foster prosperity. Then, all of this led to an increase in the prestige and power of the monarchy. So, after the death of Henry VI, the government suffered from corruption and a ton of mismanagement during the regency of King Louis XIV. So, in 1642, Louis appointed Cardinal Richelieu, which was a very bad idea. Sorry, we're getting a lot of calls from different restricted numbers and FaceTimes. I'm gonna answer one sec. Hello? Sorry about that. I've gotten like 6 restricted calls in the past minute. It's kind of annoying. I'm gonna just turn Do Not Disturb on. So, back to Richelieu, who Louis XIV appointed, which was not a good idea. Richelieu centralized the government. He did this by further encouraging the commerce and industry that increased the tax base, and he also strengthened the military, and he instituted the intendant system, not too important, which just basically gave a lot more power to the king and limited the power of the bourgeoisie's officials. So Richelieu's domestic policies, they also really strengthened the absolutism in France, which could be seen either as a good thing or as a bad thing, depending on opinion, and it prepared the way for Louis XIV. So, Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, he's a pretty famous part of European history, was actually only 4 when he got the throne, but the regent at the time was Cardinal Mazarin, and he was the prime minister, and he worked as the king regent at the time because he was too young to rule. So unlike Cardinal Richelieu, Mazarin was actually a capable administrator, and he protected Louis XIV's claim to the throne during a lot of wars. He protected it during the War of the Fronde. The Frondes, just quickly to go over that, they were nobles who sought to limit the power of the monarch to decentralize the government. Keep going with that. So he was able to actually stop that and keep Louis the power, even though he still wasn't ruling. So when Mazarin died in 1661, Louis declared himself as his own prime minister, which was the first step in his very bad decisions, which eventually led to the end of absolutism in France. So, just one quote from Louis XIV basically sums up how he ruled. He said, "I am the state," and this just proved to him that he wanted to do everything by himself. He wanted to rule the country by himself, and he didn't want anyone else to help him, or he didn't want any advice on how to do it. So, to help, not to help, but like to convince the people that Louis was correct in saying that he could do everything himself, the Bishop Bousseau, he provided actually a justification for this, and that he said that it was the divine right that Louis should be ruling, and that he was actually a god, and that just was insane, and people believed it, and they still listened to Louis XIV. So, with the feudal tradition, the French society at the time was still divided into the 3 estates made up of the varying classes. There was the first estate, the clergy, the second, the nobility, and then the third, which was everyone else, which I think was like 98% of the population. So it had in the third estate, it had like the middle class, the artisans, basically everyone who wasn't the clergy and the nobility, which was a lot. It was 90% actually, my bad. So even though Louis XIV wasn't per se the best leader, he was able to make France the strongest nation on the continent in the time. But even the industry and agriculture was the best in every of the European countries. Partly because the fact that Jean-Baptiste Colbert, he started the concept of mercantilism again, which was where someone would colonize a country, and then they would provide it with raw goods, and then they would make it into refined goods and sell it back to the mother country. So this is how France made most of its money. But he actually wanted to make France self-sufficient by building a large fleet, and he wanted to actually take over England and some other Dutch countries, but he could not afford it, obviously. France did not have that big of an army or navy, so Louis went for the army side of this, and he ended up losing to the British, of course. So France actually was able to develop in the process of trying to get world domination. France was able to develop Europe's first modern army. They actually were able to create artillery in the process, and they actually it was supplied by the civilian private contractors, but the government, instead of officers, which was due, they actually recruited, trained, and equipped troops instead of the officers. So a chain in command was established, also part of the artillery fact, and the army under Louis XIV was increased from 100,000 to 400,000, which was the largest in Europe at the time. So war was a big part of Louis XIV's policy. Actually, for 2/3 of his reign, France was at war with other countries. So there's just a ton of other wars in the process. You don't need to know the specifics, but there was the invasion of the Rhineland, the seizure of Luxembourg, and I'm going to go over the War of Spanish Succession a little bit. This is where Louis threatened to upset the balance of power. Of course, the theory that no single state should be predominant on the continent. Louis threatened to upset this by laying claim to the Spanish throne. He was going to give it to his grandson, which he just could not do. That was ridiculous to say for his part. So then the Grand Alliance, which was I think like most of the major states in Europe, they did not like this at all, and they fought on Spain's side and just demolished France, of course, because it was all the countries in Europe against France. So the Treaty of Utrecht, which was in 1713, it actually restored balance to the balance of power, and it allowed Philip V's grandson to remain on the Spanish throne. So Spain was never going to be ruled by Louis' grandson, which was never going to happen in the first place. But they just made sure that it was never going to happen. So even though France was still under the mismanagement of Louis XIV, it actually kind of had a golden age of a lot of culture and a lot of cultural influence. So French actually became the universal tongue, and it was spoken by diplomats and in the royal courts of all of Europe. So Louis actually he hired a lot of artists and writers, and he funded them. So a lot of books and a lot of paintings were painted, and then just more French literature and style, all of that stuff was under Louis. It was a golden age. So although Louis' reign, it solidified the central government, and it marked the high point of absolutism in France, his wars and shenanigans, it really just depleted a lot of the money that France had. So this left the bourgeoisies and the peasantry with enormous tax burden, since the clergy and nobility did not pay any of the taxes. So this is the third estate now that has to pay all this money that Louis is using up. So, and then now they owe all this money, and Louis decides to build the Palace of Versailles, which was another step in the wrong direction, which costed over $2 billion. I think that's adjusted with inflation for today. And that was just insane. It was totally unnecessary to build, but Louis still wanted to make it. And that was crazy to do. He did not have the money to build this palace. It's an enormous palace that costed a lot of money. Louis also made a lot of other steps in the wrong direction by suppressing the religious dissent. He outlawed Jainism, which was a form of Catholic Calvinism. He revoked the Edict of Nantes, which got rid of a lot of religious tolerance for the Huguenots, and he actually made Catholicism mandatory, which was not a good idea, because when there's religious intolerance, it leads to getting people mad and a lot of wars. So once to recap, the central government that developed in France from the religious wars was efficient, but the power of the nobles was severely weakened. Tax collection was pretty skewed because it was just only the third estate was paying and no nobles. But in the process, agriculture and trade were still able to generate some money for France at the time. So, revolution was on the brink. I think in the next upcoming videos, I'll talk about the French Revolution. So this is basically the start of it. Louis taking steps in the wrong direction, not doing for the benefit of his people, more benefiting himself. So now to switch gears, we're gonna go to England and how they were developing constitutionalism. So Henry the Sixth, who was the ruler at the time, he was the first of the Tudor monarchs, which he actually established a strong central government, and he actually was able to end the War of the Roses, which I don't have time to go over. But by regulating trade and through international commerce, he was able to make a monopoly. He was able to make charters and licenses. Henry also raised revenue from the prosperous middle class. All this money that he was making, it enabled him to finance a standing army, and it also kept the nobility in check. The court of the Star Chamber also administered central justice, and it further subdued religious nobles. Since the Tudors were beholden to the Parliament from running to the throne, Henry and his successors, including his son Henry VII, they actually talked to Parliament, which was new for a change, and they consulted with Parliament about issues that the country was currently facing. So Henry VII was slightly different from Henry VI. He wasn't as you'd say level-headed and tight-fisted. He was actually really impetuous. He was extravagant, and he was a passionate man. But he also had a kind of big temper, and he was ambitious though. So he had a great desire to maintain his legitimacy. So he really wanted to have a male heir, which led to with Parliament supports, the beginning of the English Reformation, which again we talked about in the previous video. So Edward the Sixth came after Henry VII, and he was, I think, a cripple. He was not suitable to be in the throne, and he was just not able to rule. So it was ruled by a regent. As the time Edward VI was ruling, and the regent was the Duke of Somerset. So Somerset was he was a devout Calvinist, and he imposed religion on his people, which again was not a good idea to do. So we discussed, is it can lead to civil wars. So under another regent after the Duke of Somerset, the basic tenets of the Anglican Reformation were then reinstated, and the Anglican Book of Common Prayer was made the basis for all prayer services. So Mary Tudor, who was the daughter of Henry VII, was the mother of the Catholic Catherine of Aragon. She's pretty important. She became queen when Edward died. He was the cripple fragile one. So she's queen now. So Catherine of Aragon was pretty unpopular, not only because she was Roman Catholic, but because she was married to Philip II of Spain, and Spain and England didn't really get along at the time. So they actually called her Bloody Mary, which was fitting because she burned hundreds of Protestants at the stake for going against Catholicism, which was crazy of her. and that's why she got the name Bloody Mary. So when she died, she was succeeded by her sister Elizabeth, who was Henry's daughter, by his second wife, I think, Anne Boyle. So Elizabeth I, the sister of Catherine of Aragon, is now the queen, and she's going to be the last, but I'd say the greatest of the Tudor monarchs. She reigned when the population of England was at its largest at the time, which was 3 million, and comparative to France, I think it was around like 15 million at the time. In Spain was around 10 million. So Elizabeth, like Henry VII, was pretty ambitious, and she really wanted to conquest the colonies of the New World. So Spain, as I talked about before, was the predominant power of Europe, and it really led the goal of colonization of different countries. So England kind of followed in his footsteps with Elizabeth I. In England, the church was independent from Rome, but it was pretty close to the Latin theology than other Protestant secularism that was present at the time. So the government, it balanced power between the monarchy and parliament, which was a good decision to do. And they also generated a lot of wealth for the country at the time. They were able to make rich, fertile land, and the population also grew, and there was a lot more commerce and trade. Also, the social system, they had a new social system, which lesser nobles were able to become wealthier because there was a lot more ownership of land from the lower classes. So there was more of a balance of power, which was also steps in the right direction for England. So also the classes tended to merge too. There were no really like separations. It was more of like a spectrum rather than three distinct classes represented. So shortly after the Elizabeth age, who, as I mentioned, she did a lot good for it. England came the Stuart kings in the Parliament. So in Scotland at the time, James I was the king, and he was the son of Elizabeth I, and he took the throne upon her death because there's like really no one else that was going to do it. James I believed in divine right of kings, but he didn't really like Parliament, which he shouldn't have done. I'm not saying he shouldn't have liked it, but he should have worked harder with Parliament to look forward with beliefs. He just basically ignored it. He didn't even talk to them, and in 1605, he actually killed a ton of Catholics, and they actually revolted against James, and that basically resulted in a couple of wars from 1610 to 1615. So Parliament wanted to get its power back, so James couldn't make any more stupid decisions. So the addled Parliament, which was what was left of it after James went kind of crazy on everyone, met in 1616, and it was so called the addled government because James still didn't believe that it was real. The addled Parliament spent the entire time arguing that taxes could only be matched with consent, that the rule was by the king and that the Parliament and that they were in conjunction together. So then James, who still did not like Parliament, he decided to actually just dissolve it, which was not a good idea again. So then, while there was no Parliament, this was while the 30 Years was going on, so there's no parliament. James is basically working with very few people, and he's fighting in the 30 Years' War on behalf of England. So, Parliament was still existent even though James dissolved it, and in 1621, Parliament passed the Great Protestantation, claiming free speech and authority in conducting government affairs. So, James tried dissolving this again, but of course the Parliament kept going on. So, after James died, Charles the First successed him, and he was pretty similar to James. He also believed in the divine right theory, and he did not like to deal with Parliament. So, although he was less extreme than his dad, he sometimes consulted with Parliament. He talked to them, and he wanted more funds for the country, and more taxes, which the Parliament refused to do because most of the taxes that he wanted to institute were quite ridiculous. So, in 1628, they signed the Petition of the Right, which said that basically Parliament alone can only declare taxes on the people, and martial law cannot be declared in peace times, and additionally, soldiers may not be quartered in private homes, and imprisonment should cost and require a specific charge. So, after that, there was the Long Parliament, which lasted for 1640 to 1660, 20 years. This demanded money for Charles's defeat. So, it also demanded that he impeached his top advisors because they weren't the best at doing their jobs, and the Long Parliament also wanted that Parliament should be able to meet every 3 years without Charles having a say. And with the Long Parliament, they also declared that Charles could not dissolve the Parliament. So, even though they said this, Charles again tried to dissolve the Parliament, and he even arrested the members. But this somewhat worked, and then Charles actually gathered the army and seized control of it, and this started the English Civil War, of course. So the Roundheads, they were the Presbyterians. They allied with Scotland, and they wanted Presbyterianism on England in exchange for military assistance. So on the other side, Charles is calling on the Catholics, so they were mostly in Ireland. So Oliver Cromwell, he's pretty important. He was a Puritan leader of Parliament. He led his new model army of Puritans against the Cavaliers, who were Charles's Catholic supporters, and Cromwell was actually able to defeat them. So then, eventually, we're now looking around the year of 1645. Charles finally surrenders to the Roundheads, who were the Scots. So, the Scots, after Charles surrendered to them, the Scots turned Charles over to Parliament, and then this was led by Cromwell's independents, and they favored religious toleration. So the Scots turned about and allied with Charles, and then Charles finally promised that he would impose Presbyterianism on the English. So then, shortly after Charles passed away, and then England became a republic, a commonwealth. So Cromwell is now in charge of the Commonwealth, and he got a little power crazy. He kind of flexed England's muscles, and he put his army to the test. He suppressed Irish supporters of the crown, and the Puritans also committed really bad atrocities, and they imposed injustices that would start the Irish question, so-called, for centuries. So Cromwell now, on a little hypocritical move, he started a puppet parliament, which basically he ruled through, and he got them to call him the Lord Protector, which was a little nonsensical. And Cromwell now is ruling with the support of the fake Parliament until his death. So then, his successor was his son Charles II, and he's now king. So now the time period we're looking at is around the 1660s to 1675. So this was the time period of the Cavalier Parliament, which Charles II was leading. This started the development of the Tories and the Whigs. The Tories were the nobles, the Anglicans, and they were conservatives who supported the monarchy over Parliament and wanted Anglicanism to be the state religion. On the other hand, there were the Whigs, who mainly were the middle class and Puritans. They favored Parliament and religious toleration. So since the Tories prevailed in the Cavalier Parliament, Anglicanism was restored by a series of laws that forbade them to worship publicly, and it required government officials and military personnel to practice Anglicanism, and it discriminated against other sects. So, since the Whig Party is now in charge, it is now the Parliament. It elected itself in 1679, and since it was pretty suspicious of Charles II's absolutist power and pro-Catholic tendencies, and enacted the Habeas Corpus Act, which limited royal power by enabling judges to demand that prisoners to be in court, requiring just causes for continued imprisonment, and providing for speedy trials. So shortly after Charles II was James II, who ruled from 1685 to 1688. He was pretty unpopular when he took the throne. He was a Roman Catholic, and he wanted Catholic ministers to take power, and he basically made it quite obvious that he wanted to impose Catholicism upon the English. So in 1688, the nobles invited William of Orange, who was a Hollander, and he was also the wife of James' oldest child, Mary, to take the English throne. When William and Henry arrived in England, James fled to exile in France, and then the new monarchs accepted from Parliament as right of their reign, and then the Declaration of Rights was signed, which was similar to the Bill of Rights. And as I mentioned earlier, the Habeas Corpus Act, the Petition of Rights, and the Bill of Rights all came a part of the English Constitution, which still translates to modern day. So a byproduct of that was the Glorious Revolution, which is the culmination of the evolutionary processes over the past couple of centuries, which through, you could say, a historical accident, some conflict and painstaking design, it actually increased the power of Parliament over the monarchy. In the centuries that are coming to follow, the monarchs in England came to the reign while Parliament came to rule. So although Parliament at the time of the Glorious Revolution served the interests of the well-born and the wealthy, it came to represent the people as the government, and it came to be viewed as existing and function according to John Locke's Enlightenment concept of the government. So then, finally, the English and those who inherited their political conditions would guarantee civil rights and would create modern democracy as England is today. So thank you for watching tonight. I understood that it was a little longer tonight. I'll try to keep it a little shorter in the next upcoming videos. Stay tuned for tomorrow at 8:30 when we talk about the Enlightenment.